The fifth meeting of the 129th season took place at the Society of Antiquaries, Burlington House, Piccadilly, London, and online via Zoom on Tuesday, the 15th of March. Ms. Margaret Ford, past president, was in the chair. After the minutes of the previous meeting had been read and signed, Ms. Ford introduced Professor James Raven, who delivered his presidential address entitled Monsters, Myths and Methods towards a global book biography of Eric Pontoppidan's The Natural History of Norway. When the meeting was open to discussion, the following took part: Ms. Ford, Professor Miriam Foote, Mr. Giles Mandelbrot, and Dr. Leslie Howsam. Ms. Ford closed the meeting by thanking the President warmly for his paper.
Thank you very much. Can I confirm that, can we have confirmation those are a correct record of the meeting? Thank you. You can actually sign. Here we are. And my apologies at the beginning if I wasn't speaking to the microphone for those people online. So if you didn't hear me, a very warm welcome to you, and can you mute, please? Thank you. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers this evening for the Graham Pollard Memorial Lecture. Sometimes it was that it was a good thing to be positive. But alas, we now learn that being positive is not always a good thing. And I'm afraid one of our speakers this evening is positive in the wrong way. Although I think I learn that actually he's now not positive, but nevertheless was unable to travel. So we see him, and I will introduce him in a moment. Christina Dondi, who is here, is Professor of Early European Book Heritage and Oakeshott Senior Research Fellow in the Humanities at Lincoln College, Oxford. She's also Secretary of the Consortium of European Research Libraries, since, in fact, 2009. Her work with Incunabula started in 1996 when she joined the Incunabula cataloguing project at the Bodleian, and which produced a 6-volume catalogue, Bod Inc., in 2005. In 2009, she created the international database Material Evidence in Incunabula. And during the period 2014 to 19, she was the principal investigator of the ERC-funded 15th century book trade project, which included analysis of the account book, Zonali, of the Venetian bookseller Francesco de Maris, in collaboration with Neil Harris. And the results of the project were published in 2020 in the volume Printing Revolution and Society, 1450 to 1500, 50 Years That Changed Europe. And it was shared with the general public in an exhibition in Venice, in the Cora Museum in Venice. What an amazing, for those of us that are fortunate enough to be able to see that, what an amazing exhibition that was. And its digital outputs are now available on the website. And Neil, who is joining us virtually, teaches at the University of Udine in Italy, where Neil Harris is Professor of Bibliography and Literary Studies. He originally read English at Balliol College, Oxford, followed by a PhD in Comparative Literature at Leicester and a perfezionamento in the Scuole Normali Superiori in Pisa. He's best known for his work on the Italian printed Renaissance book, especially for the Bibliographica dell'Orlando Innamorato between 1988 and 91, and more recently on the figure of Aldus. And together with Christina Dondi, he's working on this edition of the Zonali of the Venetian bookseller Francesco de Maris. And so indeed, to the lecture, I warmly welcome them, entitled The Zonali of Francesco de Maris, 1784 to 8, that's not correct, 1484 to 88, the end of the tunnel. Christina, I think you're starting.
Thank you, James, very much. It's a pleasure to be here, though very much déjà vu. Neil and I were here in this room in front of you in 2013 when we were already giving you some progress on this work, which we really would like to see finished by next year, let's say. We might have some disagreement on months, hopefully not years. And unfortunately, this time, we don't have Neil here. We generally we provide very nice double act as we disagree in most things. And we also, though, believe that this must be very healthy for the discipline because really there is no complacence at all. You know, we do things separately and then we check them together, and then we have an argument, and then eventually we get to some middle ground. The beginning of this lecture will be started by Neil, and then I'll continue on. Neil, can you hear me? The floor is yours.
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you very much. Right, have I got the salt, Christine? Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Fine,
can.
lovely. Right, and my deepest apologies to everybody for not being able to make it. I was looking forward to a few days of roistering in London and giving this lecture. And also I got my tickets some time ago. So I think the most harmful, the most upsetting thing about the whole not being able to come, of course, is the large amount of money I've given to Ryanair, which, as we all know, I have absolutely no hope of getting back. Now, as Christina's already explained, we've talked to the Bibliographical Society in the past about this document, which you can see here on the left. It's big. In a way, you need to imagine sort of having 3, nearly 4 years of sales from, say, Foyles or Dillon's. Right, they're still much larger businesses, but it's that sort of problem, having a complete record of a bookshop. In a way, is not a very exciting thing, except that in this particular case, it's 540 odd years ago, and that makes it interesting. Right. It's a very tall, angular document. Can we go on a slide, please, Christina? You can see a typical page here. It's just entries with the titles, the prices, day after day after day. It just goes on and on. Now, because I'm not there, not physically present, I'm not going to take up half the lecture time. What I want to do is just give a quick introductory 10 minutes or so of pointing something out, because what I think about this document, there's a measure of consensus from Christina. We've learned to think that if we both agree on something, it's probably wrong and we need to look at it anyway. But something we both feel, is that the document is not quite what it seems. It's not just simply a record of sales. It's got another purpose. And as a way of comparison, I wanted to talk very briefly about 2 other documents, Italian Renaissance documents, relating to book sales, which are both well known, but perhaps people at the Bibliographical Society have not actually seen images of the originals, and to posit a sort of distinction between, on the one hand, what we might call a personal shopping list or something. Now, we've all gone shopping with a sort of list and come home with some very strange objects, because mainly due to not being able to read what's actually on the list. And that is a list that is made up for personal consumption. Nobody else can really understand it. And then the other type of document is what this journal is. It's a document made out for other people to be able to understand. And I think that's a fundamental difference. Now, if we can move on a slide to the next document, this is what I would call the example of a sort of shopping list or a personal document. It's probably the most famous individual document relating to the history of printing of a certain scale, apart maybe from a few things relating to Gutenberg. The RIPOLI diary. It was discovered at the end of the 18th century in the Dominican nunnery in Florence, and it records the activities in that same nunnery from 1476 to 1484 of a printing press. Now, it was known as printing press work there because the editions are signed in the RIPOLI convent. But to have this discovery is quite an amazing one. Now, there's a modern edition done in 1999 by Melissa Conway, which occasioned a bit of debate at the time. I contributed to it. But if you look at it, and if we can go on a slide again, we can see that it's a very messy document. Things are scribbled down. And the main thing about the RIPOLI diary is that even with a good transcription, it's almost impossible to understand an awful lot of the entries. I'm just showing you on the PowerPoint probably the most single famous entry at all. It's from February 1482, and it records payment to one of the nuns, Suor Marietta, for working as a compositor on the Luigi Pulci's Morgante. And of course, the RIPOLI diary told us that there was an edition of the Morgante printed there long before one was actually discovered at Modena in 1912. So this was an interesting example of the archive document telling us something that was then confirmed by bibliographical discovery. But of course, the fascination has always been at the idea of composing nuns, a bit like singing nuns in The Sound of Music. Here we have composing nuns and being paid quite a significant sum of money. Christina does the money side of our partnership, and she will tell you that that is quite a biggish sum. Can we move on? Next slide. The other document I want to draw attention to you is instead much more like the Giornale. This is what we call the QUADERNETO of Antonio Moretto. It's a list of books sent from Padua to Venice in 1480, early in 1480. There's a first block of volumes in February, then others in April and May. It's quite a small document, but if we can look at a detail, next slide, you can see the layout. It's for every entry, you have the number of copies, the title of the book, and then the price in ducats, lira, and soldi. And the point is that these are not the actual sale prices. These are the prices that Antonio Moretto wants these books to be sold for. And the bookseller in Padua, Domenico Giglio, he has to sign this undertaking saying that he will sell these books at this price. Now, if people accuse us, of course, Christina and myself, of messing around or not getting stuff published, we can point out that we have actually managed to publish this particular document in that critical edition, transcription of the whole of the Quadernetto appeared in 2020, edited by Esther Camilla Peric, who was a pupil of mine at the University of Udine. And this has been very, very helpful from our point of view because there is a certain amount of overlap with the Giornale. And above all, it shows us that there was a considerable fall in price already in the 4 years between 1480 and, say, 1484, 1485, when the Giornale begins its record. Next slide, please. Now, the other feature of the Giornale is, of course, the identity of the person we think it belonged to. Now, we think it belonged to a bookseller and small-scale publisher called Francesco De Madis because of the back cover of the Giornale. Now, you can see it rather faintly. The photo's a bit dark, but somebody has drawn on pen and ink a publisher's mark, an orb with a double cross. That's just the sign for a merchant in the Renaissance. But in the mark, there are the two letters MF. Now, we happen to know this mark from an edition printed in Venice in 1486. It's the only time it appears, but you can see it there on the left, a large black MF, and that can only stand for the person who signs the edition just above, Francesco de Mardis. Now, who was this man? Francis May would be his name. Well, his activity as a publisher, next slide, involves some 9 editions. Now, he starts publishing in with Cicero in 1481. Now, on the whole, he doesn't print himself. There is an archive document which says that he did own type, but we don't know what it was used for. But he starts with an edition of Cicero in 1481, and then 1484, 7th of September, there is an edition of the Decretales by Pope Gregory IX. Now, and this career then goes on, and 21st of March, 1488, he publishes a Blancellus. Now, that's 2 months after the Zonale ceases to be a record, because it finishes with no explanation whatsoever on the 23rd of January, 1488. So he didn't suddenly drop dead, though we do know that he was dead in 1490. When there's a document regarding his widow. So these editions, how do they relate to the sales book? Now, this is the strange thing. Next slide, please. If we look, now the Zonale actually contains 2 lists of books. Christina will probably explain more fully. One is the sales record, but at the end of it, in the final gathering, we have a list of the stock that was in the warehouse of the shop on the day it first opened, which was Monday, the 17th of May, 1484. And this list of books begins, as quite rightly, with Cicero. This shop sold an awful lot of Cicero. Now, you can see there an entry for the Cicero De Officis cum Commentum, 5 copies, nicely marked with that little red arrow. Now, that's the edition De Mardis published in 1481. Now, we're 3 years later. But when we're dealing with the inventory of a Renaissance bookseller, though we expect there to be lots of books by other publishers, often in 1, 2, 3 copies, when it comes to the publisher's own editions, we generally expect there to be a very large pile of them. Instead of which, this Cicero, and it may not even be the 1481 edition, there have been other editions by other publishers since then, is only present in 5 copies. And much the same happens with the Decretales, which also published while this second stock list at the end of the volume is still running. One would expect a big block of copies of the Decretales to arrive. They don't. Next slide, please. So the other thing is, what the Zonale doesn't record a lot of things we would expect a Renaissance bookshelf shop to sell, because Renaissance bookshops didn't sell just books, as modern bookshops don't just sell books. They didn't. This one, the Zonale, doesn't record sales of paper, ink, writing materials, small books of any kind. The cheapest books were in the 4 soldi, and that's quite a lot of money, actually, for 4 shillings. If you can remember what 4 shillings was in the 70s, still a reasonable sum. There are no maps, no songs, no broadsheets, no T-shirts with "I love Venice" or "I kissed a gondolier and he lagooned me," that sort of thing, or no souvenirs, no glass from Murano. If we compare it, for example, to a day book, now, of course, documents that are similar to our one are very rare. But, for example, fragments of a day book from London in 1553 were found in an Egerton manuscript some years ago. And if we just look at some of the sales there, we can see sheets of imperial paper a book of psalms sold together with a quire of small paper and 2 old ballads. That's what we expect a bookshop to record. Next slide, please. So our thinking is that the giornale might not just be showing the sales in a straightforward way. For the year where we can compare books going out and stock coming in, we can see a control of the flow of books going out, coming in, that Amazon would be proud of. A book is sold, another copy arrives fairly quickly. So what we're beginning to think is that the giornale is not so much an individual single bookshop, but it's a networked bookshop. It belongs to a much rather network, and it's being supplied from a central warehouse, because one of the most striking features about it is, of course, that the incoming stock, there are no indications of price. So that, I think, is our theory, or the idea we are working up about what the real purpose of this book was. And now that's all from me, and over to her. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil, very much. And I'll continue on with more evidence from this extraordinary book. First, numbers. This is all about numbers. Numbers are still provisional. You will get many in this presentation, but don't write them down as final. There's some tweaking still to be done. Then the other most important thing that we have been doing this last over 13 years is the identification of the editions. We mark them as certain, probable, possible, because certain are certain. Luckily, we are still dealing with the first half, with the 1480s, when production was expanding, but was not incommensurate in the same way as the 90s. So often we were able to pin down certainties, and that has allowed us to do a number of processes of bibliographical identification, some of which I'm sharing with you today. So, some numbers. 11,000 plus entries, 13,000 plus copies of books sold in less than 4 years. I have to apologize publicly because I think during a previous presentation, I said 25,000. That was spreadsheets failing me, or being unable to use them properly. It is far too easy to do that. Anyway, we are in 13,000 numbers, which is quite impressive. Around 690 editions we have identified. This is the way it works. That's why you have all these different things. You can have an entry, which, like the first one, is Little Missals from Niccolò of Frankfordia, 26 of them. So, of course, you have multiple copies for a certain number of editions, repeated, and sometimes all these entries are joined together in one sale. That's why it's just almost 7,000 sales. And we always have to keep all these levels in mind, and different calculations being made. So the journal itself tells us that this bookshop was by the Rialto Bridge of Venice. Here we note the feast days when the shop in Rialto will be shut. That is the area in the heart of Venice. If we expand, it's the area to the left of the bridge where we have identified, and scholarship has identified, quite a number of printers and bookshops being concentrated in those parishes. In particular, this was work that was done for the Venice exhibition. You can see by the bridge San Bartolomeo, that is where the shop of Francesco de Madi was, as well as many others. Then the stock. As Neil said, at the end of the manuscript, we have for just about over 1 year, the books coming in stock. So almost 4,000 copies, 466 editions, including some that now we have identified as lost or unidentified. And I will test with you all, in helping us in this little mysteries. There are only 8 editions that are in stock but do not sell. Very surprising. Anyway, one is Acron, the opera of Aristotle, with the commentary of Averroes, sermons of Augustine, a diurnal, a specific one printed by Ilbressan, which we finally realized that was Jacobus Britannicus, a printer from Brescia. Then the Tractatus de Annatis and another treatise, again, Heretical Pravity, 2 editions by Harold, I will discuss even later. Finally, one of the many books of ours editions that we have now lost, and something identified, a Registrum Gregori, I'll come back to it. The volume of trade, it's rather massive. The first year, over 1,200 copies being sold for less than a year. And then you see in 1485, we get double. And in 86, double again. 87 seems to settle a bit more on a very high volume. And the projection for 1488 would have been, again, quite a substantial growth. So a very large amount of books being sold. The sales per day are also quite surprising. As Neil was saying, every bookseller today will be quite envious. You see, most of the time, it's multiple books being sold, but 511 days, more than 10 books are sold. And there are occasions when very many books are sold. And sometimes we know who to, and sometimes not. But keep this in mind, this is a real shop that sells to people, not a warehouse selling to stocks and others. Sometimes they're selling to printers, come back to that, but mostly it's just people, and mostly is individual copies. The lost editions. So think about, see if you can recognize anything. Paolo Emilio, De Rebus a Recensione Francia Gestis. I'll come back to this. We were able to identify that as bound with an edition of Iustinus. Then, of course, that is the most probably obscure. The rest is less surprising, either popular literature, like Aspromonte in Italian, the famous Orlando Innamorato, Buovo d'Antona, Il Persiano, or liturgy. And so you have journals, but see, every time we know specifically the printer. So, the journals by Andrea de Paltasikis. Today, we don't have any journals surviving from this printer. Missals, large format of the missals from Jacopo Britannicus. Again, today, we have no missals printed by the Britannico brothers. The same for the little book of hour from Antonio d'Alessandria. And again, more books of hours. The famous Psalter for kids, Salterio Puerorum, Salteriolo da Puti. Today, only 2 editions survive in the world, one in Munich, the other in Moscow. It was the most sold book of the entire lot, over 700 copies being sold, and so on. So this is what we could say that editions we have lost, 17. Then if we move to unidentified editions, 20 copies of Arbor Rhetorice. So far, we are unable to understand what this edition is. A Registrum Gregori, bound. Neil lately was thinking, but maybe it's a manuscript. Maybe. That would be very unusual, though. 2 editions of Regulae, rules for singing. And then the most mysterious for us, Meridiana. It is sold with a legal text, the Pisanella of Paganini, and the Aurora Novissima of Petrus de Unzola. So we are wondering, is this a work of astronomy? Or, if we really value what it was being sold with, is it a legal text? We don't know what it is. So overall, though, both lost editions and unidentified, it's a rather small numbers. Everything else we have identified. These are the numbers, as I said, almost certain, but not just yet. So 70% of the editions that we have identified are Venetian, from Venice. Over 13,000 of these books and copies are editions printed in Venice. But then the second most prominent presence, which we noticed already a few years ago, but it really grew in presence, is Milan. Milan and Pavia. And as you can see, 19% of the editions, or 11% of the overall volumes in copies. Then you have a much smaller percentages of some editions coming from the surrounding area of Venice, quite understandable, so Padua, Treviso, Vicenza, Verona. In fact, you're surprised that there are not more because Milan was further away. Very few also from the rest of Italy, Bologna, Rome, Naples, just a few. And then the great surprise, when we started, already in 2013, we thought this was only an Italian, sale of Italian editions. Not. There are foreign editions from Basel, Cologne, Lyon, Reutlingen, Strasbourg, Urach, Ulm. Our working theory is that they all come to Venice via Basel and via Milan. As you can see, lost edition identified, it's very marginal, it's very small number. So I will show now some visualizations of some of the data, which we are testing with a company called Flourish team, because we are aware that showing numbers and stats can be a bit dry. And so we have shared the data with them and try to come up with more immediate ways to share this information. So, for example, where are the editions coming from? They show the sort of things that we go in detail, and we can see how Milan, apart from Venice itself, Milan with 976 copies and Pavia, it's very prominent. Then I said Basel with 39. Now, of course, a real visualization should not be like this, but should be via Milan. So when we work in more detail, and that is important when we are trying to establish real trade rules. But that is something that we need to discuss with these developers. So the trade with Basel, it's really substantial. And we started by, of course, finding editions that could only be Basel, certain. And then we realized that they were part of groups and trends. The kind of work that is printed in Basel is quite heavy going, you would say. I mean, it's theology, mostly, actually, I would say, theology and medieval texts. More. as you can see here. In a case like this, for example, we have the casus iuris civilis and the casus iuris canonici. We were struggling a bit with this, but then we realized that Michael Wenzler was the only printer who printed both. And that is one of the ways in which we understand when we are in doubt. You know, if books, editions bound and sold together tend to be by the same printer. And this is one of such cases. Then, of course, again, you see Cologne, Strasbourg, Urach, of course, is very close to Basel, Reutlingen, and then the rest of Italy, Padua, Bologna, Parma, Rome. Another way to try and present the information that we didn't know it existed is this. You know, of course, we assigned a subject to all of ISTC some time ago. The 15th century book trade did it. And that means that all the identification that we have done on the spreadsheet for the Giornale has got subject allocated as well as period of the author. And so obviously Venice is the largest share. In Venice, they printed absolutely everything. So I've done a focus on Milan, where you can see immediately that legal texts is what was coming from Milan. And second, you have literature, where those are Greek editions. Greek editions were coming from Milan. And then also interesting, quite a core of medicine, if you consider that in the 15th century, medicine was not printed in large numbers. So while the law was printed in large quantities and still survived today well, medicine developed much more, we know, in the 16th century, but important editions were printed, and a number of them came from Pavia or from Milan. Production by period. Again, you see how the medieval period overall is, of course, very well represented in the sales. But then if you combine humanist and contemporary, you have a decent number there for everything that was printed from 1450 onwards. And that matches even the classical editions. If you look at Venice only, these are the kind of numbers reflecting the editions produced in Venice. If we move to bestsellers, that is, it's always fun. You can see just at a glance how much green there is there, light green. That is grammar. And those are the Psalterium Puerorum. Those are Donatus. Those is Alexander de Villadei. These are all the grammars that even if today they have survived so badly, then were the bestsellers. Absolutely more than the Bible that you can see down there with only 108 sales, for example. And second is obviously more understandable liturgical books. So grammars, education, teaching how to read, and then liturgical books. Those are the great bestseller. They tried to show this kind of the highest copies overall according to periods and the number of copies. So again, it shows how medieval and then second classical. I don't stay much more on this. These are live. You can click on just one subject. For example, here I selected law, and it shows the quantity that was produced of the medieval and contemporary law. And this instead is theology with a kind of different pattern and larger number of copies being sold. And this is grammar, which of course has got a glaring mistake. It does not include the Salterioli da Puti because the little note of the developer says at the end, we only include editions with a precise date of sale or date of printing. And of course, the Salterioli da Puti are the lost editions. So they have not been used by the developers. They will have to be used because otherwise all these these presentations would not be accurate. Some images comes from the exhibition in Venice, where again we wanted to convey the not very well known truth that these little psalters for teaching kids how to read were the best sellers for this period, and they costed between 1 and 4 soldi, and for that amount you can buy between the pound of cherry or the chicken. Of course, not everybody could buy a chicken lightly, but let's say it was not unattainable. And in fact, the quantity of these copies being sold and purchased shows that the correlation between the development of printing and the expansion of literacy, and the fact that already in the 1480s, printing is more attainable by many, and the Giornale is a testimony to this. Again, the Regole de Guarino Veronese, 252 copies sold at the same price of 4 soldi. Another way to compare the cost of books with the cost of living, we use data from the archives of Venice of the same time, so an excellent yield cost 4 soldi. Or again, more grammar, Greek grammars, 46 copies sold. Again, the cost 5 soldi. You can have a haircut for 4 soldi, or buy 100 squid. You will convey that it's not for everybody, but certainly for many more than before. So, going through the Giornale, we discover all sorts of new information about the book trade and the printing trade. One of these things is the fact that we identified people we didn't know before. For example, il Grisolaro, a Bible in vernacular of the Grisolaro, the Deche of Livy del Grisolaro. It took us some time to realize that, and then we discovered that had been discovered in the 1950s already. Anyway, Jacobus Grasolarius was a little-known Venetian humanist who clearly was involved financially, and that was not known, in the production of printed books in Venice. And the same we have Missale de Silvestro. You look at Silvestro in ISTC, you don't find the name of a printer. So again, it took a while to realize that Silvestro is the brother of the famous Battista de Torti, often addressed in a very familiar way. Clearly, Silvestro never left his name in the colophons, but he was deeply involved in the business. So, of course, the question came to us even recently with Niels. So, which Venetian printer is not represented in this Giornale? And luckily, we have the lists of the Venetian printers, and going through the names, basically, there are just a bunch that are not mentioned much. One is Johannes Leo Villers. I think probably appears only once. Guglielmo Anima Mia. But then you see, we're already looking at an activity of these printers from 1486 onward. So at the time when the Giornale is almost then in 88 finishing. Hamann, it appears once, but of course he was very prolific, so it's slightly surprising, but again, he's active in 86. And Bonetto Locatellus, who printed a lot of vernacular, you see 147 editions, he's not there, but just about it. Everybody else who was printed in Venice, is in the Giornale. That is the amazing volume of this account book. Let me now explain what we gather about the bookseller's habits. You know, you're familiar with the printer's habits. Bookseller habits are the same, you know, allowed us to get more certainty, bibliographical certainties in these identifications. And I remember when talking almost 10 years ago, say, we will probably get help with finding these booksellers' habits. And it's true, we have, and we have found them. So, from small things like bibliographical confirmation. Here you have Fernandus Cordubensis, printed in Assigned to Rome, Herald, not after 12 of August 84. So the date comes from the Gesamtkatalog der Wiegendrucke, which dated before the death of Sixtus IV, so 12 of August 84, because the Pope is mentioned as alive. And now we can redate it, not after 17 May 84, because there are 2 copies in stock. So in a case like this, we have write a file, notify ISTC and GW. But more so, if we look at this other work by Harold, Gundisalvos de Villadiego, now it was assigned to Johannes Sugonis de Genbach by ISTC, and to Harold, 82, by the Gesamtkatalog der Wiegendrucke. 2 copies unsold in the stock, May 84, which confirm the date assigned by GW. And so it can't be 85 because it's there in 84. And then we also find that Harold supplies other editions. So it's the most likely printer, though this edition is apparently not sold in the Giornale. Cases in which editions by the same printer are sold together. And this, it's like not just 2 editions, like sold together as 1 book. So, 150 novelle. 150 novelle, at first we were looking for 1 edition. There is not. These are 2 editions considered at 1. Boccaccio, 100 novelle, 100 novels, and Masuccio Salernitano Novellino, 50 novels. So in December 86, 1 copy is sent for binding of these 2 together. You see 150 given in legatura for the legatura dei libri. And so here we are, and we found these 2 editions by the same printer, Battista de Torti, very much in the same period. So our probability goes to these, because then they are sold together. Other cases, Terenzio et Orazio con commento in the stock, or con commento and ligato. Again, here we are talking about 2 different editions being sold as 1. In both of them are by Johannes de Gregoris. So this would confirm also the identification of the printer, Johannes de Gregoris, which is such in ISTC, but the non-revised GW had assigned to Bologna and Faelli. So this is a case where we would notify GW, and the printer for these 2 editions very likely is Johannes de Gregori. The Giustino and Emilius ligato, the one I mentioned before. So one is Justinus Epitome by Filippo di Pietro, and the other is a lost edition. The fact that is not a mistake, but is really probably a lost edition, is that we found a reference to a later edition of the same work being printed in 1515, translated, and later on still, 1548, the same text in Latin is being printed. So I think here we can with certainty say this is an edition we have lost because probably existed even before the 16th century editions. Scansiones peroti et omniboni. Here again we have 2 editions by the same printer, Bonino de Boninis of Ragusa, printed very closely in around 1483. And yes, basically, once we realized that this sort of mechanism was going on, it has helped substantially. Quintillian, both the proper quintillian and the pseudo, are printed in Treviso by the Peregrino de Pasqualibus. The case of Jacobus de Forlivio, all the editions of Jacobus de Forlivio are printed in Pavia. An edition is certain, so that was the starting point. The Embrione et Anatomia can only be that edition by Antonio de Carcano. So then, because they were being sold together, we start realizing that the others are also by the same printer. And this case in particular, we see is another edition, though from a different printer, same place of printing, and this allows us to redate again the assignment which was given to this edition before. Antonius de Carcano, printer of Pavia, supplied also several medical editions, like Mundinus, Giovanni de Concorrezzo, Pantaleo de Confluenza, works on physics. So again, you see the trends of what was coming into this bookshop. Other editions that are by the same printer or the same place are like all the legal editions of Alexander Tartagni. They all come from Milan. All the legal editions of Ludovico Pontano, the other come from Pavia or Milan. And the legal editions of Bonifacio VIII and Clement from Milan, again, one specific printer. So, again, trends are being formed. And this happens for others. Petrus de Palude comes only from Strasbourg. There are 3 editions. One is certain, the other maybe not. But there is one, these 3 texts are all printed by Strasbourg Vitae Patrum printer. So it's most likely that those are the editions coming to Venice. The classical texts in the vernacular without the commentary, they all come from Filippo di Pietro. They all seem to be always a bit old, and they sell cheaply. And I get the impression that this Filippo di Pietro was doing emancipated printing ante litteram, but in a medieval format, because he's doing what later Aldus Manutius does, get rid of the comment. He printed only the text, but he does that in a very medieval kind of layout. And so it's not very successful. And we can see that it doesn't sell fast or it's not expensive. Fast sellers. Il Novellino, you can see, printed in Venice, 8th of June, 84. 7 copies are added to the stock the day after. The day after. And by, 5 days down, no, 3 days after, they're already sold. I mean, it's that fast. And it's not a unique case. Ubertino da Casali, L'Arbor Christi, printed in Venice, 12th of March, 85. 4 copies are added to the stock 4 days later. The first copy is sold on the 9th of May. The Martyrology of Usuardus, printed in Pavia, 15 March, 87. So, of course, this also has to travel from Milan to Venice, but the first copy is already sold at the end of May. De Nativitatibus, printed in Venice, December 85. Again, 5 days later, it's already sold. Small Decretum by Tommaso de Blavis. July, end of July, beginning of September, again, it's gone. So even heavy stuff like legal texts. In a way, we notice this. Fresh editions on the market, they go fast and they cost a lot, and then the price goes down. Speed of sale, I'll go quickly here. You know, we are testing this visualization, but let me keep going fast on this. This is very important, the drop in prices. So, initial comparison between the Quadernetto that you've seen is the consignment in Padua, dated 1480, and the Giornale, 1484. One case, Paolo Pergolensis, printed in 77. In the Quadernetto, the wanted price is 40 soldi. 4 years later, less than half, 15, 16 soldi, less than half. A trend that is confirmed also with another work, Paolo Veneto, La Summetta. In the Quadernetto, 124 soldi, that's 1 ducat. 4 years later, half, 60 soldi. A drop in price 4 years on, half. And I think that's a trend that we're going to see over and over again. And that, of course, having looked at some of the prices in the 90s, in some other inventories, you see continuously dropping. But what we discovered in the Giornale itself is the drop in price when a new edition appears on the market, and the Madis very, immediately drops his own price. Just one case. Thomas Aquinas' Catena Aurea, printed in Venice, September 82, first gets sold at 140 soldi, then 134, then down to 90 soldi. What happens? What happens is that in April 86, there is a new edition. So the stock that was already there, the price goes down until they get rid of. And we see this over and over again. Ugo Senensis, medical, Pavia. The initial copies are sold at 80 soldi in 84, down to half, 40 soldi in 85. Why? Because in 85, you have a new Venetian edition by Andrea Calabrenses. So it drops the price to sell. The same here, from 40 to 20, the sermons of Leo the Pope, absolutely similar case. And this is wonderful because here the price is dropped twice, and twice we can tell when a new edition enters the market. And one of those editions, he sells himself. So Caracciolo, very popular sermons, first start at 90, then down to 60 soldi in 85, now to 50 soldi in 86. Because this was an edition of the 70s, 79. So the moment you have the early 80s edition, there is a first drop. And he sells that edition. That edition, he sells it at 70, but then drops the price of his old stock to 50 to make sure he sells that stock as well. Very shrewd operation. Discounts. That's, of course, the other thing. We have many editions, as we said, sold together as one sale, and that means one price. By understanding the value of each individual edition and copy, we can understand when clearly math doesn't work. So a discount is taking place. In this case, Breviloquios of Bonaventure, what we have is that generally sells at 16 soldi. But then the multiple sale in May 87, a copy is sold with Papias, generally sells at 50, Tortellius at 55, the Dialogues of San Gregorio at 33, for a total of 134 soldi. Basically, this means that there's been either a discount of 20 soldi, or maybe the Bonaventure was thrown in as a gift, which happens sometimes when you also see, we won't discuss it today, but a chunk of many editions or all of legal texts. And then there is a book of hour thrown in, or a grammar thrown in. And so when we'll do the final calculation for that as well, we might well see where discounts are taking place. One question that is being raised, and we don't have a solution, and we'll all have to wonder, is the More Veneto, the dating that, as you know, it is taken for granted every time we have editions printed in Venice. The fact that between January and March of a year, More Veneto still retains it as the previous year. And so often in all repertoires are dated 85, 86, January 85, 86, February 86, 87, because More Veneto means that is already the new year. Well, where we have cases when clearly the rule of the More Veneto does not apply, like in this one here, where 24th of December 84 does mean December 84, because then the book is present in a list and so of 84, so it could not have been printed in 85. And so some cases like these, we can tell More Veneto was not used. How many more do we have to revise? That's a big question. So I could finish with this, and maybe I have questions. Otherwise, I have a few more slides about the customers. But up to you, because I understand it's not a light lecture. So thank you for now.